How to attack the castled king. That's exactly what you're going to learn in this lesson. And without further ado, let's start with the first example where we will discover a few most important ideas about the attack. Let's take a look at this position. It is a game between two club players and it is white to play. We can see the opposite side castlings and white starts the pawn assault, which is somewhat a standard idea because just like we need to open up the position to attack the centralized king, we should do the same while trying to attack the king which has already castled. We also need to, first of all, somehow remove those pawns, or at least some of them, that cover the king so that we can get right into it. And that's what white started doing by pushing the pawn to g5. Black tried doing something similar on the queen side, and then white continued with pawn to h4. Black replied queen a5, and there comes h5. White just continues his plan, and even though black managed to grab the pawn on d5, it didn't really help because white just opened up the h-file, and now once the h-file is opened, white is ready to start attacking the opponent's king directly, which he did by playing queen to h3. And all of a sudden black resigned because he just realized that there is no way to protect his king, and at the same time the queen is also attacking a bunch of squares and pieces along this diagonal h3 to c8, and therefore there is just no way for black to survive. He resigned. Even though it may seem like a very trivial example of just a pawn assault against opponent's king, there is one thing that I would like to highlight here, which is also a very important thing that a lot of people miss to understand. Let's take a look at the starting position of this example once again. Let me just take those few moves back. Let's think about this. Why is it that the white's attack, started by the move pawn to g5, went out so successfully and so easily? It happened due to the fact that most of the black's pieces are concentrated on the queen side of the board. And therefore, if we focus the attention on the king side, we would notice that the opponent's king has almost no defenders. Maybe only the bishop on e7 is somewhat close to the king and, at least to some extent, maybe controlling some squares around, but that's the only defender. While if you look at the white's position, once he started pushing his pawns forward, we can see that his queen took part in the attack, his rook took part in the attack, and even the other pieces such as knight, it's also standing very close to the king. It can go there very quickly, somewhere close to the opponent's king. And the rook from d2 is also ready. Within just one move it can be transferred somewhere to the queen side along this attack. Which means that, with the exception of the bishop on c1, all of the white's pieces are ready to take part in the assault, while most of the black's pieces are situated on the queen side. And that's an extremely important idea to realize. In order for your attack to be successful, you need to have greater concentration of your pieces against an opponent's king, greater compared to the quantity of defenders. And that is why this attack went out so easily for white. And also, this is exactly the fact that black underestimated. Otherwise, he would start bringing up more reserves. For instance, if black would just, bring at least his bishop closer to the king, and then, transfer it to the g7, then already everything would be just okay with black. And, black is just fine here. But because black failed to realize the simple truth that the king needs some defenders, he lost the game. With that being said, let's move on to the next example. Here's another game between Alekhin and Rubinstein, two famous players of the past. It is white to play, and right now it does not really seem like white has any real chances to attack the opponent's king. And yet there is one thing which you may pay attention to, which is also a very important factor. It is the fact that black does not have that pawn on h7. Whenever you notice that the opponent's castling is weakened, that one pawn is moved forward or is absent, like in this example, it always gives you the sign that you may try to take advantage of those weaknesses. But first of all, in order for your attack to be successful, you need to have greater activity. You need to have greater concentration of your pieces on the king side compared to the amount of the opponent's pieces. And that's what we should care about first of all. With that being said, white played pawn to g3, trying to kick away that queen from f4. Black noticed that there is also his pawn on b6, which is hanging, and therefore he moved the queen away to protect that pawn, which was probably a wrong decision because he moved the queen too far away from the king side. Anyway, that's what he did, and now white continues bringing more pieces towards opponent's king. He plays knight to g5. We have said earlier that you need to have greater concentration of your pieces on the king side, greater quantity of pieces around the opponent's king compared to the amount of defenders. And that's why you need to bring more and more pieces closer to opponent's king before you can start creating some real threats. This is exactly the idea behind the move knight to g5. In this particular example, surprisingly, this move also creates a straightforward threat. White is threatening to take that pawn on f7. And even though the pawn is protected by the rook from d7, if the rook is moving away, white can grab that another rook on e8. So that's the threat that white created by playing knight to g5, but the main idea was actually just to bring the knight closer to the opponent's king. In order to prevent knight takes f7 from happening, black played rook to d8, and here white found a way to deliver a straightforward checkmate. Well, it's not in one move, but within few moves actually. He played bishop to g6, and the idea of this move is to vacate the square for the queen, where it can be transferred to the king side. Simultaneously, this bishop g6 sacrifice also further blockades the king on h8, because now the black's pawn from g7 cannot move, and so the king on h8 just stuck there, it can't really move. And therefore white can simply play queen e4, and he's just winning because he can bring the queen here to h7 either via the h4 square or perhaps after taking the pawn on g6 and black is defenseless. So that's also a good example of white's attack being successful, and it also seems like everything went so seamlessly for white, and I hope that you can understand why is that so. First of all, once again, you can see the greater concentration of attackers. White has knight and queen in the attack, while black has, well, only bishop on f8, which doesn't do much anyway. And secondly, because of the weaknesses around the black's king, in particular due to the fact that there was no pawn on h7. That's another clear sign that you may try to find attacking moves and they may work out. Alright, let's move on to the next example. Here's one more example in the game between grandmasters, I guess, Knaak versus Malic. It is white to play currently, and what do you think about this position? Is there any way for white to attack, or is there even a chance for white to attack, or should white just do something else instead? Well, I would say that in this position there are options actually. White may just continue playing in the center and play something like rook to e1, and that would certainly be a very good alternative. However, there are some signs that the white's attack on the king side may be successful. In particular, it is due to the fact that white has a number of pieces looking towards black's king, and therefore that's already a pretty good assault group that white may use in order to start the attack. The second factor, the second sign, is the fact that the black's pawn is on the h6. Whenever any pawn in opponent's castling is moved or absent, it creates some holes that you can use to penetrate into, or you can use this pawn to sacrifice some piece against it and to destroy the opponent's castling this way. In the particular case, white played bishop b1 using a very typical idea of creating a battery. Along this diagonal, putting the queen in front of the bishop, and there, with the support of the bishop, this queen can penetrate into that weak h7 square, delivering a checkmate simultaneously. Let's see how it went out. Black played queen to d6. Here white played a preparatory move, king h1. Black replied with rook to e8, and here white played queen to d3. Now he is ready to eliminate the knight, first with the bishop and then to jump with his queen forward. The move knight e4 does not work for black to close this diagonal because white can simply play f3. That was the idea of the white's preparatory move, king to h1. He wanted to remove the king from this potential dangerous diagonal. So knight e4 does not work, and otherwise, what else can he do? In fact, black is already defenseless. He played bishop d8, just somehow trying to protect that knight, but it didn't really help. White just eliminated the knight which was defending the h7 square, and now white is ready to penetrate into the opponent's camp and start the straightforward attack of opponent's king. Black played king f8. Here comes the next question. How can white possibly continue his attack? Well, white can give a check to h8, but the king goes away and there is no straightforward continuation. That's why white used another common idea, which we already discussed earlier, the idea that you can destroy the pawn shield around the opponent's king by making a sacrifice. And white took knight takes f7. This combination actually wins by force, because after black recaptures, white can continue chasing the king by playing bishop to g6 check. King goes away, white took the rook, and then he plays queen g8, and there is no way for the black's king to survive. White is ready to attack it with queen and two rooks. Well, notice that black's rook and bishop are still on their initial positions and can't really help. Black played queen f8, there followed rook e1 check. Now again, black's king can't move away because the queen will be lost on f8. Black tried playing bishop e7, but now white made the final sacrifice, which wins the game right away. Can you notice the sacrifice? It's rook takes e7, followed by rook to e1 check. And now, if king goes away, white will simply grab that queen on f8, and therefore white wins the game. Black resigned. Also a fairly cool game which illustrated a number of ideas of attack, starting from concentrating pieces around opponent's king, also using weaknesses to penetrate into the opponent's position, and finally sacrificing material to destroy the pawn shield around opponent's king. And here is the final game of this lesson between Yemelin and Nepomniachtchi. Both of them are grandmasters. It is white to play, and white pushed his pawn forward to g4. The idea is pretty straightforward. He wants to push the pawn forward to g5 with a dual idea. Black actually played knight c6 and white played pawn to g5. The idea is that, first of all, it kicks away the knight from f6. As we already know, in order for your attack to be successful, you need to have more pieces around opponent's king. That's why eliminating one of the defenders is surely a good idea. The second thing is, in order to start the straightforward attack, we need to do something against those pawns which cover the king. And you can do only two things. Either you can push your pawns, exchange them or sacrifice them and open up the lines this way, or you can sacrifice your piece against one of these pawns to eliminate them. So basically only two options you have to unwrap the position of opponent's king. And here white uses this pawn assault. Black took the knight on d4 in between, white recaptured, black played back knight d7. Currently the pawn on g5 being attacked by the bishop, but in a way it's not a big problem for white. He played queen h5. He brings one more piece closer to the opponent's king, and it's always a good idea to bring your queen close to opponent's king, because queen is actually the best attacking piece. Because it controls so many squares, it is such a powerful piece that can actually deliver a checkmate. And in the majority of the cases, the checkmate is delivered by the queen. That's why it always makes sense to try to involve it into your attack. Here black played knight to c5. By the way, what do you think about this move? Is it a good move, a bad move, or average move? What do you think? It's interesting that we discussed earlier that in order for your attack to be successful, you need to have more pieces around opponent's king. And you may notice that black voluntarily moved the knight away, further to the queen side, away from the black's king. So this is certainly a big mistake. It's clear that white is trying to attack, and therefore black should actually try to bring more pieces to defense, not moving them away. Therefore knight c5 is definitely a mistake. And it's played by Nepomniachtchi, a strong grandmaster. Therefore, it's just you just can see that when you understand these general strategies, everything becomes so clearer to you, what you should do and what you should not do. Alright, white continued with rook to g1. Again, he brings one more piece into the attack, and it actually creates already a bunch of various attacking opportunities. Even one of them, it's like not really a threat, but just a cool thing. That's why I like to show you. Let's say black plays something like a5. Potentially in some variations, not right now, but in some variations white even may play a cool move queen h6. Attacking the square on the g zone with the idea that if black recaptures, white actually recaptures with a pawn, and boom, it's a checkmate all of a sudden. Again, I'm not saying that white should be doing it right now. Here black can defend, but it's just one of the ideas that white may use, and it shows how powerful white's position already is. Black played rook e8, and here white simply played rook g3. Now the threat is very straightforward, to play rook to h3 and then to take that pawn on h7 with the queen. And all of a sudden you can see that black is already in a big trouble, just because white has so many pieces on the king side and black has almost nothing. Black tried playing knight takes b3, pawn takes, and then pawn to e5. The black's idea is that now the h3 square is unavailable for the white's rook, and he tried to somehow close the position, but white found another way to get to the black's king. He played knight to d5, and the idea is to jump with this knight forward onto f6 on the next move and force black to take and open up the g file so that white can attack the king. So as we discussed earlier, two ways to remove the pawns: either use your pawns or sacrifice your piece. And here white prepares this knight f6 sacrifice. Black tried to prevent it. He played pawn to g6. White moved the queen forward to h6. Now, certainly black can't really take the bishop, because in this case the white's idea just works out very easily. Knight f6 check. This knight has to be taken, and in this case pawn takes the bishop and queen g7 is unavoidable. Black can't really do this. Let's see what he did instead. Instead he played king to h8. Black is desperately trying to somehow hold his position, but now white found a cool way to win the game. He first sacrificed the bishop. We'll see in a moment why, like what's the idea behind it, and then he jumped knight f6 anyways. And the point is that after this exchange, which is forced, black plays rook g8, trying to cover this vital g7 square, but now white can win the game. Can you find the winning continuation? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. After the white's next move, black resigned immediately. It's the move rook to d8. Congratulations if you found it. It deflects the rook from g8, and therefore black can't stop queen g7 on the next move, which will be played no matter what. And that's, by the way, was the reason for white to sacrifice the bishop on e5. It just enables open up the d file so that white can play rook d8 at this point. That's been another great game that illustrates basically all the typical ideas of attack of opponents' castling. And I hope that knowing these strategies will now be way clearer for you to know when to start an attack and how can you do this. Again, as always, keep in mind this key idea that you need to have greater concentration of the pieces around opponent's king. You need to have greater activity, and only then your attack will be successful.